The sharp crack of the slap shattered the morning silence. Clara Johnson staggered back, a burning sting spreading across her cheek, but she refused to flinch. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The crowd froze, their eyes wide with shock. Phones were raised, recording every second of what had just happened. Officer Eric Simmons stood before her, his face flushed with rage, his hands still tingling from the impact. He had lost control, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he grabbed Clara's wrist, yanking it hard before snapping a pair of cold metal cuffs onto her wrists. "Who do you think you are to talk back to me?" he growled, shoving her toward the patrol car. Clara took a deep breath, her sharp gaze locked onto him, unwavering. Amidst the gasps and murmurs of the gathering crowd, a small smile curled at the corner of her lips. "You just destroyed your entire career, Officer Simmons." Eric hesitated, just for a second. Then he scoffed. "Oh yeah, you think you can scare me?" He sneered. "I'm just following protocol." What he didn't know was that the truth was about to explode in his face. Who was this woman? Why would one slap send shockwaves through the entire police department? And what would happen when Clara Johnson's true identity was revealed? If you think you know where this story is going, think again, because the next twist will leave you speechless. Inside the cramped patrol car, Clara's wrists ached under the tight grip of the handcuffs. She leaned back, her eyes following the flickering glow of the streetlights against the window. No panic, no fear, not even anger. Just calm, unshakable certainty. Outside, the crowd was growing restless. "Let her go," someone shouted. "We caught everything on camera. This is police brutality." The distant wail of sirens signaled the arrival of backup, but Clara knew there was no need for reinforcements, because the real nightmare was about to begin for the men who had just arrested her. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, Clara's mind drifted away from the present, slipping into a memory she could never forget. The low hum of the patrol car's engine filled the silence. Officer Eric Simmons gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set as he stared straight ahead. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. In the back seat, Clara Johnson sat motionless, her wrists bound by the cold bite of the handcuffs. Yet there was no panic in her eyes, no rage, no fear, only a quiet, calculating stillness. Eric stole a glance at her through the rearview mirror. To him, she was just another nobody, another troublemaker who had dared to challenge his authority. What he didn't know was that she was so much more than that. The summer heat pressed down on the cracked asphalt of Westfield, the neighborhood where Clara Johnson had grown up. The houses stood weathered and tired, their peeling paint a testament to the struggles of those who lived there. 10-year-old Clara had been playing basketball with the neighborhood kids when the first shout rang out. She turned just in time to see a line of police officers standing outside a small house, the house she knew belonged to her father. Her heart pounded. Her father, Marcus Johnson, stood on his own doorstep, his hands raised in the air, his voice calm but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I was just checking on my neighbor." The officer leading the charge, a young, pale-faced cop with a hardened expression, ignored his words. "Hands where we can see them. Now." Marcus did as they asked, but it didn't matter. One officer stepped forward, yanking his arms behind his back, twisting them harder than necessary. Clara's mother gasped, gripping her shoulders tightly. "Mama, what's happening?" Clara whispered, her small hands trembling. Her mother said nothing, only shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. Clara broke free. She ran toward her father, screaming as she pounded her tiny fists against the officer's leg. The officer didn't even look at her. He simply shoved her aside like she was nothing. Clara hit the ground hard, the rough concrete scraping her knees, leaving streaks of blood on her skin. Her father turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers, filled with something unspoken. She didn't understand it at the time, not until years later. That was the moment Clara Johnson changed forever. She had learned a brutal truth. Justice didn't come naturally. If she wanted to change the system, she would have to fight for it. The sharp blare of the patrol car's siren jolted Clara back to the present. She sat in the back seat, wrists still bound, but her mind was sharp, focused. She was no longer that helpless little girl on the pavement. Now she held the power, and Officer Eric Simmons was about to find out exactly who she was. As the car rolled down the road, the dim glow of the streetlights flickered against the window. Eric tightened his grip on the wheel. His mind was a storm of thoughts. He had been a cop in Pine Haven for years, patrolling the streets of Willow Ridge Estates, ensuring that everything remained neat, quiet, and controlled. People like Clara, people who didn't fit the mold, were disturbances, and disturbances needed to be dealt with. His father, a hardened military veteran, had drilled that belief into him since childhood. A cop never backs down. When you wear that badge, you are the law. That lesson had followed him from his stiff back seat at the dinner table to the streets of Pine Haven. And right now, that lesson told him that Clara Johnson was the problem. Eric hadn't needed a report from a resident. He hadn't needed an official complaint. He had seen her jogging alone through a neighborhood like this, and that was enough. He had pulled his car forward, cutting her off, watching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of fear. But she hadn't flinched. She had simply removed an earbud and asked, calmly, almost amused, "Can I help you, officer?" He had asked her where she lived. She had replied, just as calm, "Right here in this neighborhood." He hadn't believed her. He had demanded ID. She had shaken her head. "Didn't think I needed ID to go for a run." That had set him off. The crowd had started to murmur, recording him, whispering about how it was just another case of racial profiling. He had felt the weight of their stares, the creeping doubt in their eyes, and he had hated it. He had to take control, so he made a decision, and he made the wrong one. The slap had been instinctive, an act of rage and desperation. And now, as the patrol car rolled into Bayview Precinct, Eric Simmons felt something he hadn't expected, a cold knot of unease in his stomach. The second they stepped into the precinct, everything changed. A sharp voice rang out over the radio. "Stop right there!" The entire room fell silent. Eric froze, his grip tightening around Clara's arm. Then a door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Captain Daniel Cooper, his superior, and in his hands, a tablet playing a video. The video, the slap, the crowd screaming in outrage. The moment everything changed, a cold weight settled in Eric's stomach. Clara tilted her head, her voice impossibly steady. "Looks like you didn't check social media before bringing me in, Officer Simmons." Captain Cooper's voice was like a knife cutting through the silence. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Officer Simmons." And in that moment, Eric knew this wasn't just a problem. This was the end. The red and blue lights flickered against the dark pavement, their glow casting jagged reflections beneath the dim streetlights. Clara Johnson stopped, not out of fear, but because she already knew exactly what was coming. She reached up and calmly removed an earbud, turning her head slightly. Her gaze was steady, sharp, unwavering. Across from her, Officer Eric Simmons slammed his patrol car door shut, adjusting his holster with the unconscious arrogance of a man used to having his authority obeyed without question. His posture was stiff, his expression a mix of caution and the smug entitlement that came with unchecked power. "Stop right there," he ordered, his voice sharp, commanding, as if he were speaking to a criminal caught in the act. Clara didn't flinch. She simply observed him, the way a seasoned chess player sizes up an opponent, calculating his next move before making her own. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, unhurried. "Can I help you, officer?" Eric didn't like that answer. He didn't like the way she stood there, calm, unaffected, refusing to shrink under his gaze. People like her always reacted the same way when confronted by the police: fear, anger, desperate explanations. But she was different, too composed, too confident, too comfortable. His jaw tightened. What are you doing here? His arms crossed, his stance widened, a subtle flex of dominance. Clara glanced at the patrol car that had deliberately cut her off, then back at him. There was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. I'm jogging. You don't see that? Eric felt it, a shift, an imbalance of control that he wasn't used to. No, this wasn't normal. A black woman jogging alone in this neighborhood? That couldn't be all there was to it. We received reports of suspicious activity, he said, his tone laced with forced authority. You match the description. Clara let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. Oh yeah? And what exactly does that description say? He had no real answer, and they both knew it. His frustration boiled over. Where do you live? He demanded, searching for any flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Clara crossed her arms, exhausted by the predictable pattern. Right here in this neighborhood. His skepticism barely hidden, Eric scoffed. You got ID on you? She shook her head. Didn't think I needed ID to go for a run. Eric let out a dry, humorless laugh. No ID, no proof. Sounds suspicious. By now, the street had started to change. People slowed their steps. Some paused. Some had their phones out, recording. The whispers began. She's just jogging. What's the problem? Looks like another case of cops harassing black people for no reason. Eric heard them, and he hated it. He hated being watched. He hated the creeping doubt in their eyes. He hated that for once, his authority was being questioned. Irritation burned inside him. She was making him look weak. He took a step closer, his voice lowering dangerously. How about you tell me the real reason you're here? Clara inhaled deeply, her tone unwavering but sharp. Are you stopping me just because I'm jogging through this neighborhood? His teeth clenched. He hated that question. He hated the way she was flipping the script, forcing him to justify himself. But he had nothing, and he knew it. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was watching. He had to do something. He had to take control. So he made a decision, and he made the wrong one. The slap cracked through the air like a gunshot. Clara's head snapped slightly to the side. A burning sting spread across her cheek. But when she straightened, her eyes hadn't lost their calm. She turned back slowly, deliberately, locking her gaze onto Eric. The crowd fell silent. Someone whispered, "Did he just—" Another voice, hushed and horrified, "Oh my God, he hit her." And then a third urgent voice, "I got it all on video. This is going to explode." Eric's breath caught for a moment. It was as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. But in that fleeting second, he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Every phone was recording. Every person had witnessed it. This wasn't just a routine stop gone wrong. This was a public execution of his own career, and the sentence had already been handed down. Eric's mind raced. What now? What could he do? His instinct told him to double down, to control the narrative before it controlled him. So he grabbed Clara's wrist again and yanked her forward. His voice, forced and hollow, barked, "You're under arrest, resisting an officer." A murmur swept through the crowd, a mixture of anger and disbelief. The recording didn't lie. She had done nothing wrong, and everyone watching knew it. Clara let him cuff her wrists, not because she was powerless, but because she was letting him dig his own grave deeper. As he shoved her toward the patrol car, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "You should have done your homework, Officer Simmons." For the first time all night, a chill ran down Eric's spine. The crowd's voices grew louder, demanding answers, demanding action. Someone shouted, "You have no right to arrest her. We saw everything." Another voice called out, "We're sending this video to the news. Right now." And then, a police radio crackled to life. A sharp voice, calm but urgent. "Stop right there. Bring her to the station. Do not put her in holding. Repeat, do not put her in holding." Eric's stomach dropped. What the hell was happening? Then just as they reached the car, Clara turned her head slightly, smiling just enough for him to see. And in that moment, Eric Simmons finally understood. He had just arrested the one woman who could end him, and she had no intention of letting this slide. The moment the cuffs clicked open, the atmosphere inside Bayview Precinct changed. The silence wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Every officer in the room stood frozen, their eyes darting between Officer Eric Simmons and the woman he had just tried to humiliate, the woman who now stood completely unfazed. Clara Johnson rubbed her wrist slowly, the deep red marks standing out against her skin, a silent testament to what had just happened. She looked up, her gaze razor sharp, dissecting Eric Simmons piece by piece. Her voice when she spoke was calm, measured, but undeniably lethal. I warned you, and now you're done. A few feet away, Captain Natalie Parker didn't move. She simply held up the tablet, letting every officer in the precinct see what was already spreading like wildfire online. On the screen, the video played in stunning clarity. The slap that echoed through the night. The way Clara had stood her ground, unshaken. The shock, the outrage from the gathered crowd. The whispers growing into shouts. This is police brutality. We caught it all on video. She didn't do anything, he just attacked her. And worst of all, the footage was already viral. Tens of thousands of people had already seen it. The media had picked it up. News outlets were calling the precinct before Eric had even walked through the door. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just a bad situation. This was the end. Vanessa finally lowered the tablet. She turned to Eric, her expression unreadable. But her voice was a death sentence. Do you even know who you just arrested, Officer Simmons? His mouth went dry. He swallowed, forcing himself to cling to the last remnants of control. A troublemaker, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Someone resisting police authority. The room shifted. A ripple of disbelief swept through the officers. A few shook their heads. Others looked away, ashamed, as if unable to watch what was about to happen. A rookie officer took an unconscious step back, his face drained of color. Vanessa didn't blink. She spoke, her voice sharp as a blade slicing through the silence. You just handcuffed and assaulted one of the most powerful figures in the judicial system. The air left Eric's lungs. The words hit him like a hammer. Clara stepped closer, her presence crushing. The room was watching her now, not him. And for the first time in his career, Eric Simmons wasn't the one in control. Vanessa's words echoed in his skull. This is Chief Inspector Clara Johnson of the National Bureau of Ethics, my superior, and yours. The realization sank in. The whispers grew louder. Someone exhaled sharply. A younger officer muttered under his breath, "Oh my God." The tablet screen flickered, now showing headlines from major news outlets. Breaking, high-ranking official assaulted by police officer, caught on camera Bayview Precinct under fire. Shocking video sparks. Outrage, violent arrest of top ethics, investigator raises questions about police abuse of power. Thousands of comments scrolled past on live broadcasts. Fire him now. Another racist cop caught in 4K. She didn't even do anything. How do you slap someone for jogging? He needs to be arrested, not just fired. She warned him, and he still ruined his career. The world was watching, and it was too late to stop it. Clara took another step forward. This time, Eric Simmons actually stepped back. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to scream. Her quiet confidence was enough to shatter everything he thought he knew about power. She had been planning this moment long before tonight, and now it was playing out exactly as she intended. You should have done your homework, she said again. Her tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't angry. It was final. Captain Natalie Parker turned her attention to the other officers in the room. Her orders were clear. Officer Simmons, hand over your badge and weapon, effective immediately. The room reacted instantly. Another officer, expression grim, stepped forward. Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't happening. This wasn't happening. This wasn't, now, officer, a beat of silence. Then, with shaking hands, Eric reached for his badge. The cold metal felt heavier than it ever had before. He unpinned it, placed it in Vanessa's outstretched palm. Then his gun, the final symbol of authority, ripped away in an instant. Vanessa turned to Clara. Do you wish to press charges? A long pause, then Clara smiled. Oh, absolutely. The room erupted. Eric barely registered the hands gripping his arms. A pair of officers, his own colleagues, escorted him out of the room, not as an officer, but as a suspect. The hallway stretched long before him, every step a reminder of what he had just lost. He had spent his entire career believing that power belonged to men like him, that people like Clara Johnson had to know their place. But tonight, he had been proven wrong, and the world would never forget it. The silence inside Bayview Precinct was no longer just uncomfortable. It was absolute. The moment Captain Natalie Parker spoke, Officer Eric Simmons felt the world collapse around him. Eric Simmons, you are officially suspended from duty, effective immediately. The words hit like a freight train. His chest tightened. His vision swayed. This wasn't supposed to happen. This couldn't be happening. His mind screamed for something, an argument, a defense, anything to fight back. But nothing came. He was drowning. What? He managed to choke out. His own voice sounded distant, hollow. Vanessa didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned the tablet screen toward the room, letting everyone see what the world already knew. Breaking. Police officer suspended after shocking video goes viral. Bayview Precinct under fire. Officer brutalizes black woman during routine stop. He's done. Public demands justice as video gains millions of views. His name was everywhere. His face looped on every news station. The video of him slapping Clara Johnson played over and over again. The headlines kept coming. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't just suspension. This was an execution of his career, of his reputation, of everything he thought he was. A command cut through the silence. Strip him of his weapon, badge, and credentials. Now. A ripple of movement, but no one stepped forward to defend him. Not his partners, not his friends, not the men who had once laughed with him over beers. Instead, they all looked away. An officer unholstered Eric's gun, handling it with careful precision, like it was evidence. Another officer plucked his badge from his chest. The absence of the weight was unbearable. His heart pounded. His body froze. No one said a word, because they all knew. This was justice, and there was no coming back. Clara took a single step forward. She stopped inches away from Eric, the weight of her presence crushing. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was a verdict. Do you still think you have power, Officer Simmons? Eric tried to swallow the lump in his throat. The room was watching. The air was thick with judgment. His colleagues, the same men and women who had once stood by his side, now stood against him. He clenched his fists, desperation clawing at his voice. I didn't do anything wrong. It sounded pathetic, weak, like a drowning man begging for air. I was just doing my job. His own words felt empty. I had the right to be suspicious. The silence didn't break. No one agreed, no one nodded, because no one believed him anymore. Clara's voice was calm, but every word cut deeper than the last. Did you think that badge made you powerful? Eric's breath hitched. You never had power, Officer Simmons. Her words settled into his chest, suffocating. And just like that, it's gone. A pause. Because you abused it. The officers didn't object. They didn't defend him. Because everyone knew she was right. The realization hit like a fatal wound. And for the first time in his life, Eric Simmons felt powerless. The glass doors of Bayview Precinct swung open. Clara stepped out into the flood of flashing cameras, her sharp gaze meeting the avalanche of reporters. A wall of microphones thrust toward her. The questions hit like bullets. What are your thoughts on the arrest? Are you pressing charges? Do you think the department will fire Officer Simmons? Are you suing? But Clara didn't rush to answer. She moved with quiet certainty, stepping forward onto the marble stairs. Her face was no longer unreadable. Now it carried something stronger, an unwavering sense of control. She wasn't here to defend herself. She wasn't here to explain. She was here to decide. The reporters pressed closer. The moment was hers. She met the cameras head on. Her voice was steady, deliberate, undeniable. This wasn't just about me. The reporters hesitated, a brief stillness before the frenzy resumed. Pens scratched, cameras rolled, voices overlapped. Because they all knew this single statement would define the headlines. Within hours of Clara leaving the precinct, the video exploded, trending #1 on Twitter. Millions of shares across Facebook and TikTok. Primetime news coverage. The headlines grew stronger. Police officer exposed in viral video. Suspended instantly, the woman he thought he could bully just destroyed him. Eric Simmons' career is over, and the world knows it. Thousands of comments flooded in. She warned him, and he still destroyed himself. Power isn't a badge. Power is justice. He lost everything because he couldn't stand seeing a black woman with confidence. She didn't just survive. She won. The department issued a statement. Effective immediately, Officer Eric Simmons has been placed on indefinite suspension pending an internal review. But everyone already knew. This wasn't a suspension. This was the end. And as Eric Simmons sat alone, his badge gone, his name forever tarnished, he finally understood he had never had power. By the time the sun set over Pine Haven, the city was no longer the same. It had transformed into a battleground for justice. Social media erupted. Facebook and Instagram became a wildfire of outrage. Millions watched. Millions commented. Millions shared. Justice for Clara, End Police, brutality, accountability. The hashtags dominated global trends. But this wasn't just another internet scandal. This was a movement. The system under fire. Evening news outlets seized the story. Police chief caught in national scandal. Corruption and racial bias under scrutiny. Clara Johnson exposes a broken system. It wasn't just about Eric Simmons. It was about all of them. For the first time in years, people weren't just questioning the system. They were demanding change. The headlines weren't fading. They were growing stronger. The streets speak louder than words, but the outrage didn't stay online. It spilled into the real world. Protests erupted across the country. Outside Bayview Precinct, thousands gathered. Voices rose in unison. Chants shook the streets. Justice for all. No immunity for police. We will not be silenced. People from all walks of life stood together. Teachers, even former police officers began to, for the first time, the cover-ups, the good cops who silenced, if no, not the public, not the politicians, and definitely not the system. The government scrambles. The movement hit Washington, D.C. like a wrecking ball. Lawmakers felt the pressure. Legislative hearings were hastily scheduled. Press conferences turned into battlegrounds for reform. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of history. Clara Johnson hadn't just exposed one bad cop. She had sparked a revolution. And this time, the fight wasn't going to be silenced. Miles away, in a dark and rotting apartment, Eric Simmons sat alone. Everything was gone. His career, his friends, his family, everything. The headlines mocked him. Scattered newspapers lay across the dust-covered table, each one screaming the same message. Officer fired after viral video. Eric Simmons, the disgraced cop. The man who became a national embarrassment. Even when he turned on his laptop, the screen was filled with hatred. His email inbox was a toxic wasteland. You're a racist pig, abuser of power, Hope you rot. Social media was even worse. Memes mocked his downfall. A remix video of him slapping Clara Johnson, set to comedic music, had over 1 million views on YouTube. The world was laughing at him. Abandoned by his friends ignored him. His colleagues distanced themselves. His phone stopped ringing. No one wanted anything to do with him. Even his own family turned away. His father, a proud veteran, refused to let him visit. His mother, she didn't even pick up the phone. The person you are trying to reach is unavailable. Please leave a message. He stopped leaving messages. What was the point? He had gone from being a respected cop to a man the world wanted to forget. Eric stopped leaving his apartment. He could feel the stares of the neighbors. He used to be the one they called for help. Now they wanted him gone. The walls of his crumbling apartment closed in. Empty liquor bottles littered the floor. The TV flickered in the darkness, replaying the same damn footage. The slap, the arrest, Clara Johnson standing tall. The scene looped endlessly in his mind, like a nightmare he could never wake up from. At first, he blamed everyone, the media, the people who filmed it, his former colleagues. But as the days passed, his focus narrowed. His rage locked onto one person, Clara Johnson. She did this. She challenged me. She ruined me. His own voice became a whisper in the dark. She took everything from me. She's not the victim. She's the reason I lost it all. And from that anger, that humiliation, a new thought began to form. If she destroyed me, his fingers trembled as he typed her name into the search bar. Clara Johnson, every article, every video, every public appearance. He watched her speeches. He saved every piece of information. Her face filled his screen. Her words haunted him. And the more he watched, the deeper his resentment grew. His career was dead. He would never be a cop again. But Clara Johnson? She couldn't get away with this. He refused to let her walk away unscathed. And so, in the darkness of his decaying apartment, with his bloodshot eyes reflecting in the glow of the screen, Eric Simmons began to hatch his plan. The dimly lit bar smelled of old wood, cheap whiskey, and broken dreams. Officer Eric Simmons sat slumped over his drink, the ice melting in the glass, his mind swirling with rage and alcohol. Then a man sat down next to him, not a random drunk, not someone looking for conversation. This man was here for him. "I know who you are," the stranger said, his voice calm but deliberate. "And I know what you want." Brian's grip tightened around his glass. He turned his head slightly, his instincts flaring. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice rough. "What do you want?" The man smirked. "To help you get what you want," he said, leaning in, "to bring down Clara Johnson." Brian narrowed his eyes, scanning the man's face. He was in his late 40s, sharp-eyed, with the calm confidence of someone who had been in this game for a long time. "How do you know about me?" Brian asked, his tone colder now. The man chuckled. "I know a lot," he said. "I know the media has dragged you through the mud. Your family has turned their backs on you. Your colleagues pretend they never knew you. And I know what you're thinking." Brian said nothing. The man leaned in. "You want revenge." Brian felt his anger boil. It was true, but he wasn't stupid. "And you?" he asked, voice tight. "What do you get out of this?" The man grinned, something dangerous flashing in his eyes. "I have my own reasons," he said. "Let's just say I have connections. People who hate Clara Johnson just as much as you do." Brian hesitated. It was too convenient, but his hatred burned hotter than his suspicion. "All right," he said finally, his voice low. "Tell me the plan." The man smirked. "Good, we start right away." Brian fell into his new routine easily. Every morning he sat in his old rusted car, parked just a few streets away from Clara Johnson's office. His eyes locked onto the entrance. He had memorized her schedule, when she arrived at work, where she went for lunch, what time she walked home. She never took the same route, but Brian was patient. He was watching, learning. Who did she meet? Who did she trust? What weaknesses was she hiding? The questions circled his mind like vultures, but he needed more. One night, Brian found himself in a dingy office on the outskirts of town. A private investigator sat across from him, a man who handled cases no one else wanted. Brian slid a thick envelope across the desk. "I need information on Clara Johnson," he said, his voice sharp. "Everything, her past, her relationships, her career. If there's anything dirty, I want to know." The investigator lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. "I don't care why you want this," he said, "as long as you pay up." Brian nodded. "I need the most detailed report possible. Don't leave anything out." Days later, Brian received a lengthy report: old relationships, cases she had handled, people she had worked with who had since disappeared. He combed through the details, connecting dots that weren't really there. Then he found his opening. A case Clara had worked on years ago. A case that had been stalled due to lack of evidence. It didn't matter that there was no crime. All he needed was doubt. Brian sat in his dark apartment, pinning notes to a board, drawing lines between unrelated pieces of information. A plan was taking shape. He didn't need proof. He just needed people to question her. Once doubt spread, Clara Johnson would start slipping, and Brian would be waiting. It started small. A post on an anonymous blog. "Clara Johnson has a history of abusing her power. Sources claim she hid evidence to protect corrupt colleagues." Could she be involved in financial misdeeds? No proof, no credible sources. But that didn't matter, because the internet doesn't need proof. It just needs a spark. The post spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Clickbait articles followed. Fake headlines flooded the web. "Clara Johnson under investigation for corruption." Sources say she took bribes to hide evidence. Anonymous experts weighed in. "She's been hiding something for years," one article claimed. Others resurfaced old photos, twisting harmless moments into conspiracies. And just like that, the truth no longer mattered. The damage was done. Clara's phone buzzed constantly. Calls from reporters, emails from colleagues, messages from strangers demanding answers. Are the allegations true? Did you really cover up evidence? Do you have anything to say? At first, she ignored them, but the rumors kept spreading. Even reputable news sites started asking questions. She knew the truth. She had never taken a bribe. She had never hidden evidence. But the public wasn't waiting for facts. They wanted a scandal. And Brian had given them one. Brian sat in his car, watching as Clara entered her office, her posture tense. He smirked. The plan was working. She was under pressure. She was on the defensive. And people were starting to doubt her. All he had to do now was push her a little further. And when she finally broke, he'd be there to watch her fall. The cameras flashed, the hum of whispers filled the room, and Clara Johnson stood at the podium, her face calm, but her presence commanding. This wasn't just a press conference. This was a declaration of war. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "In recent weeks, my family and I have endured baseless slander and fabricated accusations, an organized attack meant to destroy my credibility." She let her words settle. The room fell silent. "But let me make something clear." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto the cameras. "I will not remain silent." The reporters scribbled furiously, microphones inching closer. The headlines were already forming. "Clara Johnson fights back against corruption allegations. Chief ethics investigator accuses police ties in smear campaign." But Clara wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to fight back. "These lies aren't just about me," she continued, her voice unwavering. "They are about a system that protects corruption. A system that seeks to destroy anyone who dares to challenge it." The room buzzed with energy. This wasn't just damage control. This was a challenge, a promise, a warning. Clara knew words alone wouldn't be enough. She needed proof. She needed names. The moment she stepped away from the podium, She activated a private investigation. Trusted lawyers, financial experts, cyber investigators, the best of the best. Their mission? Follow the money. Trace the online smear campaign. Find the people pulling the strings. But these weren't amateurs she was up against. They were professionals, and they knew how to cover their tracks. The money moved through offshore accounts. The blog posts came from fake profiles. The news articles were planted in third-rate tabloids before leaking into mainstream media. But Clara had seen this play before. She knew how to dismantle it. Piece by piece, the cover-up began to unravel. And then they found it. A large financial transaction, hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through a fake charity. And the source? A group of former police officials, men who had protected officers like Eric Simmons, men who had looked the other way when abuses of power were exposed. And now they were funding the attack against Clara. It was personal, it was targeted, it was a message. Stay in your place. But Clara had never been one to back down. The evidence was solid, and she was ready to go public. The conference room was packed. More cameras, more reporters, more eyes watching. Clara stood tall, holding a thick folder in her hands. She didn't waste time. Over the past few weeks, an organized effort has been made to destroy my reputation. Today, I present to you the people responsible. She opened the folder, pulling out documents and placing them on the projector screen. A series of bank transfers, names, dates, transactions linking corrupt officers to the smear campaign. The room erupted. Reporters shouted over each other. The camera flashes became blinding. One reporter stood, voice rising above the noise. Are you saying this smear campaign was orchestrated by law enforcement itself? Clara didn't hesitate. I'm saying certain people within law enforcement, people who have enabled corruption for years, are behind this attack, and I'm exposing them. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the headlines changed. Breaking. Corrupt officials linked to smear campaign against ethics chief. Clara Johnson strikes back. Names exposed. Who is really behind the false accusations? The tide was turning. And Clara, she wasn't finished yet. Eric sat in his rundown apartment, the glow of his laptop the only source of light. He was watching, reading, panicking. The plan was falling apart. Claire had been supposed to break. She had been supposed to disappear. Instead, she was fighting back and winning. The people who had backed him, the ones who had promised him revenge, were now being exposed. His phone rang. His hands trembled as he answered. A familiar voice on the other end. Eric, you idiot. You led them to us. The line went dead. Eric swallowed hard, his chest tightening. The walls were closing in. And now he wasn't just a disgraced cop, he was a liability. As the scandal unfolded, Clara made one last move. A formal request for a federal investigation. It would dig deeper into the corruption. It would uncover everything. And it would finish what she started. The system that had tried to silence her was now on trial itself. Her enemies had tried to destroy her. Now, they were the ones running. And Clara Johnson, she stood victorious. For now, because she knew one thing, corruption never dies easily. And the fight was far from over. The storm raged outside, thunder rumbling in the distance as Clara Johnson stepped into her home. She knew something was wrong. It wasn't just a feeling, it was the air itself. The house felt different, too still. Her instincts, sharpened over years of exposing corruption and dismantling dangerous networks, screamed at her. She placed her bag down slowly, scanning the darkened living room. Nothing was out of place, yet everything felt off. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a warning. Her fingers twitched near her pocket where she carried her phone. Then she noticed it, the hallway light switch. It was slightly off-center, like someone had moved it recently. She always turned it fully up before leaving. Someone had been here. Clara's breath slowed. She reached into her bag, fingers curling around the small can of pepper spray she always carried. Just as she took a step forward, a floorboard creaked upstairs. She wasn't alone. Eric Simmons stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the baseball bat tightly in his sweaty palm. His breathing was heavy, ragged from anticipation. He had waited weeks for this moment. The humiliations, the public disgrace, the loss of everything, all because of her. And now she would know what it felt like to lose control. Behind him, three masked men shifted impatiently, hired thugs. Men who didn't ask questions as long as the money was good. Eric had told them one thing before breaking into her home. She ruined my life, now we ruin hers. They had slipped in like ghosts, disabled the security system, unplugged the Wi-Fi router, cut off any chance of her calling for help. Now she was trapped. One of the men, a tall figure with a scar down his cheek, whispered, "She's here. Let's move." Eric took a slow breath, stepping forward. The floor groaned beneath his boot. A tiny sound, but Clara heard it, and she was ready. The moment Eric and his men descended the stairs, Clara moved. Fast. She didn't hesitate, didn't wait to be attacked, didn't give them control. With a swift motion, she grabbed the heavy lamp from the console table and swung it with full force. Crack. The first intruder dropped, collapsing onto the floor with a grunt of pain. Before the others could react, Clara was already moving. She pivoted, ducking beneath Eric's wild swing as he brought the bat down toward her. The wood splintered against the coffee table, missing her by inches. Her adrenaline surged. They weren't expecting this. They had come for a victim. Instead, they found a warrior. "Get her!" Eric roared. The second thug lunged. Clara sidestepped, sending her elbow straight into his gut. As he doubled over, she slammed his head against the wall, knocking him out cold. 2 down. But Eric was already coming at her again. This time, she wasn't fast enough. The bat caught her side, pain exploding through her ribs. She stumbled, gasping. Eric sneered. "Not so tough now, are you?" Clara gritted her teeth, her vision blurring for a split second. She refused to go down, not like this. Her eyes flickered toward the kitchen, the back door, her only chance. She darted toward it. Eric and his last remaining thug chased her, footsteps thudding heavily behind her. She reached for the door handle. Too late. Eric grabbed her hair, yanking her back. She gasped in pain as he threw her against the counter. The cold metal of a kitchen knife glinted nearby. But before she could grab it, Eric pinned her arms down. His breath was ragged, his face twisted in rage. "You think you're untouchable?" he spat. "That you can ruin my life and just walk away?" Clara struggled, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She needed to act, now. And then, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. Red and blue lights flooded through the windows. A booming voice shattered the tense silence. "This is the Pine Haven Police Department. Drop your weapons and step out now." The sound of shattering glass as officers stormed in. Eric froze. His expression twisted from rage to pure panic. He had planned everything. Disabled security, eliminated cameras, cut off outside communication. But he hadn't counted on one thing. Clara Johnson had left a fail-safe. Clara stared into his eyes, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Did you really think I wouldn't have backup?" Eric's face drained of color. The sound of heavy boots filled the house as officers swarmed in, weapons raised. He was finished. Completely. One officer grabbed him, slamming him onto the kitchen floor, pinning his arms behind his back. "Eric Simmons, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit assault, and attempted murder." The cuffs snapped shut. Eric's breath came out in short, ragged gasps. It was over. He had tried to destroy her, tried to take everything, but in the end, he was the one who lost it all. The next morning, the world knew. Breaking news. Former disgraced officer Eric Simmons arrested for attempted attack on ethics chief. Justice served. Clara Johnson survives attack. Police raid captures conspirators. The internet exploded. The same media that once doubted her was now praising her resilience. The same voices that had once spread lies were now calling for harsher punishment for Eric and his conspirators. Clara, she didn't celebrate. She just watched because she knew there would always be more like him, more men who feared strong women, more corrupt officials trying to silence justice, and she was ready for them. Clara Johnson's breath was steady, her stance firm, but inside her mind raced. She needed an escape. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. The dim glow of the living room lamp flickered against the polished floor, casting elongated shadows that danced eerily against the walls. The scent of damp wood and rain drifted through the open window, a window she might need to use if things escalated, and they were about to. Eric Simmons stood just a few feet away, a gun trembling in his grip. His bloodshot eyes burned with rage, his chest rising and falling erratically. He wasn't just angry, he was desperate. "You ruined my life," he spat, his voice raw with fury. "Now it's your turn to pay." Clara didn't flinch. She could hear movement behind her. He wasn't alone. Footsteps crept closer, slow and deliberate, attempting to box her in. She had seconds, maybe less. "Eric," she said evenly, her voice unwavering, "put the gun down. You don't want to do this." Eric let out a sharp, humorless laugh, his grip tightening. "Don't tell me what I want. I have nothing left to lose." His fingers twitched near the trigger, his eyes darting around the room like a caged animal. Clara kept her hands still, showing no signs of panic. "You're wrong," she countered, her voice low and deliberate. "You still have something left. Your choices. If you pull that trigger, there's no turning back. You'll be just another failed man who let his hatred destroy him." He hesitated. She saw it, the flicker of doubt, the hesitation in his fingers. His grip wasn't steady, and his stance wasn't firm. Clara had faced worse men than Eric, men who thought violence was power, men who mistook fear for respect, and she had taken them all down. "Shut up!" Eric snapped, his voice trembling as if even he didn't believe his own authority anymore. "This isn't about choices. You took everything from me, my badge, my career, my life." Clara held his gaze, unshaken. "No, Eric, you did that to yourself." His face twisted in rage, and his knuckles whitened on the gun's grip. The room had gone deathly silent. Only the sound of rain tapping against the window broke the stillness. Then everything happened at once. The sharp crack of shattering glass ripped through the room as a tactical team stormed in. Boom! A flash grenade detonated, disorienting the intruders. The moment Eric flinched, Clara moved. She lunged sideways, throwing herself behind the kitchen counter as the SWAT officers poured in, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun!" Eric spun, eyes wide with panic. His hand jerked upward, but before he could react, thud! A rifle butt slammed into his wrist, sending the gun flying across the floor. He let out a pained yell as two officers tackled him, forcing him to the ground. One of the thugs tried to run. Bad idea. An officer intercepted him with a brutal takedown, slamming him against the hardwood floor with bone-crushing force. Clara rose from behind the counter, completely composed. Eric struggled against the cuffs like a wild animal, his breath ragged. His eyes darted around in frantic desperation, looking for a way out, but there was none. His gaze landed on Clara, who stood over him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For the first time, he saw himself clearly. Pathetic, defeated, finished. She bent down, her voice quiet but filled with finality. "You had a chance to change, Eric, but you threw it away." His breath hitched, his face twisted in despair. "You took everything from me," he choked out, his voice breaking. But no one was listening anymore. The SWAT officers dragged him away. The last thing he saw before being shoved into the back of a police van was Clara Johnson, standing tall, unmoved, victorious. Weeks later, the trial of Eric Simmons gripped the country. Every news outlet covered it. Disgraced officer faces. Justice Eric Simmons found guilty. Faces life behind bars. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, legal experts, and the very citizens Eric had once sworn to protect. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Attempted murder, home invasion, armed assault, orchestrating smear campaigns. When the guilty verdict was announced, Eric didn't even lift his head. His fall from power was complete. Once a man who wore a badge with pride, he was now nothing more than a disgrace. No one spoke his name with respect anymore. No one remembered him as an officer. He was a symbol of failure. And Clara, she had become something else entirely. Clara didn't celebrate Eric's downfall because Eric Simmons was never the real enemy. He was just a symptom of a broken system that had protected men like him for too long. And now that system was crumbling. The movement she had ignited exploded across the country. Protesters flooded the streets. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Former officers exposed the corruption they had witnessed. The nation listened. The tide was turning. Clara didn't just survive Eric's attack. She shattered the foundation of every corrupt official who thought they were untouchable. In an interview days later, she sat across from a journalist, calm but determined. "Eric Simmons was never my goal," she said simply. The reporter leaned in. "Then what was?" Clara's eyes burned with conviction. "A society where no one is afraid to speak out against injustice." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "This is just the beginning." The screen faded to black. The world had no choice but to listen. The story of Clara Johnson and Eric Simmons is more than just a tale of a corrupt officer's downfall. It is a reflection of the deep-rooted flaws in a system that has, for too long, protected those in power while silencing the voices of justice. It exposes the dangers of unchecked authority, the destructive nature of hatred and revenge, and most importantly, the power of resilience, truth, and unwavering courage in the face of oppression. Through Claire's journey, we learn that justice is not just about bringing down one corrupt individual, but about dismantling an entire structure built on fear, intimidation, and abuse of power. This story serves as a reminder that fighting against injustice is never easy, but it is always necessary. At the heart of this narrative is Clara's refusal to be silenced. From the moment she was falsely accused, attacked, and slandered, she did not crumble under pressure. She stood her ground, knowing that the truth was on her side. Her greatest weapon was not physical strength, but her mind, her ability to remain calm under fire, to strategize rather than react, and to outthink those who sought to destroy her. This is an important lesson for anyone facing injustice. Retaliation through violence or emotional outbursts only gives power to the oppressor. True power lies in the ability to stay composed, gather evidence, and strike at the right moment. Clara's patience and intelligence allowed her to expose Eric Simmons not just as a single corrupt officer, but as a product of a corrupt system. Another key takeaway from this story is the consequences of unchecked hatred and revenge. Eric Simmons did not lose his career because of Clara. He lost it because of his own actions. His inability to take responsibility, his deeply ingrained prejudice, and his obsession with control led him to make one fatal mistake after another. At any point, he could have chosen to walk away, rebuild his life, or even acknowledge his wrongdoing. But instead, he let his hatred consume him until there was nothing left of the man he once was. This teaches us a crucial lesson. Revenge is never a solution. Holding on to resentment, refusing to accept accountability, and seeking to destroy others out of spite only leads to self-destruction. Eric thought that taking down Clara would restore his power, but in the end, he only destroyed himself. Hatred is a poison that erodes everything, including the one who carries it. The story also highlights the role of public accountability. Clara's story would have been buried if not for the power of witnesses, media coverage, and social activism. The people who filmed Eric's abuse, the journalists who reported on it, the protesters who demanded justice, they were just as important as Clara herself. This teaches us that justice is not achieved in isolation. Every voice, every action, and every stand taken against injustice contributes to a larger movement that forces change. If those bystanders had remained silent, Eric Simmons would have walked away without consequences. But because people spoke up, because the truth was broadcasted to the world, a corrupt officer was held accountable. The lesson here is simple. Silence enables oppression, but collective action dismantles it. Moreover, Clara's story shows us the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. Even when she was being falsely accused, when smear campaigns threatened to ruin her reputation, and when her personal life was being attacked, she did not give up. Instead, she fought back smarter, stronger, and more strategically. She didn't just clear her name, she turned the tables on her enemies. Many people, when faced with such overwhelming odds, might have chosen to retreat. But Clara understood that if she backed down, the next person to be targeted might not be strong enough to fight back. Her battle was never just for herself. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, wronged, or oppressed by an unjust system. This is an important lesson in today's world. When you stand for what is right, you are not just protecting yourself, you are paving the way for future generations to live in a fairer society. Finally, the ending of the story delivers one of its most powerful messages. Justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about creating change. Clara's goal was never to simply destroy Eric Simmons. He was just one man. The real battle was against the system that allowed men like him to thrive for so long. This is why she didn't stop after his conviction. She used his downfall as fuel to drive a larger movement. She understood that if systemic corruption was to be eradicated, it wasn't enough to remove one bad officer. The entire culture of abuse, silence, and intimidation had to be dismantled. This lesson is crucial. True justice is about transformation, not just punishment. In conclusion, this story is a testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It teaches us that power is not about force, control, or status. It is about integrity, truth, and the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. It warns us about the dangers of hatred and revenge, showing us that those who let bitterness consume them will always fall. And most importantly, it reminds us that justice is not the responsibility of one person alone. It is the duty of every citizen, every witness, and every voice willing to speak up against oppression. The fight for justice is never easy, but as Clara Johnson proved, it is always worth it. If you found this story powerful and eye-opening, don't forget to like the video to support our content. Share it with your friends and family so more people can hear this important message. And comment below with your thoughts. What would you do in a situation like this? And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another gripping story like this. Your support helps us continue to stay tuned. There's so much more to come.